Sometimes the people who know you best are the very ones plotting your ruin. Jennifer Miller, a financial analyst who built her life on data and meticulous control, walked into my childhood home expecting a warm welcome. Instead, I overheard a conversation that felt like a surgical cut to the core. My parents were selling the craftsman house I'd poured 7 years and over $120,000 into, calling every penny a gift, with chilling finality. The only thing colder than the Seattle rain outside was the calculating look in my mother's eyes. Would my training to find the truth be enough to fight a betrayal rooted in love? Find out how one woman's meticulous paper trail took down the ultimate family fraud. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The afternoon in Seattle was all sharp, clean lines, much like my life. My calendar, color-coded for optimal efficiency as a senior financial analyst, showed a sudden, unexpected gap. A canceled meeting in Spokane. A rare and almost unsettling gift of time. Instead of diving into my meticulous spreadsheets, I decided to drive east. I hadn't planned on going home, but the impulse, a desperate, familiar tug for validation, was too strong to ignore. I pulled my sensible sedan up to the curb of the Arbor View Craftsman, the house my parents Eleanor and George Miller had nearly lost several times over the last 7 years. I eased the front door closed behind me. The scent of antique cedar and lemon polish hit me first, followed by the specific comfortable squeak of the third stair, a small familiar flaw George promised to fix every spring. I clutched a bag holding the expensive artisan coffee beans I knew Eleanor loved, a peace offering to ensure my welcome. My footsteps slowed as I neared the kitchen. That's when I heard it. My name. Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact, discussing me as casually as she'd discuss the grocery list. Once the appraisal clears, we list. Jenna's transfers were gifts. She doesn't have receipts. My breath caught the coffee bag crinkling like dry autumn leaves in my fist. George chuckled, a low, easy sound that usually signified his approval, now holding a cruel edge. Then Sarah's hesitant whisper, "But are we absolutely sure she won't find out?" I froze, the honey-colored light filtering through the leaded glass, the house's warmth suddenly turning cold. My body remained still, but my mind, the analyst trained to catalog facts and detect fraud, clicked into instant cold clarity. 7 years, over $120,000 in transfers. Just 3 days ago, I'd sent $1,800 marked mortgage payment, a routine deposit, in my desperate decade-long quest for their approval. I thought I was protecting them from ruin. I realize now I was simply their most reliable source of income. I placed my knuckles against the doorframe, gripping the worn wood until the blood drained white. The emotional shock was channeled into a single devastating calculation I had been used. I stepped into the hallway. "No," I said, my voice unnaturally steady. "I'm already aware." Eleanor's face flushed an ugly pink. George appeared behind her, tall and imposing, yet somehow smaller than I remembered. He offered a dismissive wave. "Your help was a gift," he stated, the word landing like a physical slap intended to wound and dismiss. Eleanor, recovering instantly, began the familiar nauseating guilt trip. "After all we've done raising you, the sacrifices for your education?" I cut her off. I didn't defend myself or rage. I simply stated the fact of their betrayal. I laid the bag of expensive coffee beans, the peace offering I could no longer give, on the entry table, a final offering to a shrine that never deserved my devotion. "I will be in touch," I told them, turning my back on their gaping, panicked faces. I kept walking, my footsteps measured and calm, the only way I could control the earthquake that had just shattered the foundation of my life. Outside, the November air was sharp. I slid into my car, pulling away from the curb without a single glance back. The long drive to Seattle stretched ahead, but for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't running from a problem. I was driving toward a solution. I didn't cry on the 7-hour drive back to Seattle. The tears, like my emotion, were put into escrow. All I felt was a cold, surgical clarity. My parents hadn't simply failed me, they had executed a meticulously planned financial fraud built on the one thing I valued most, the American cultural value of family loyalty, which they knew I would never violate. Now, all that loyalty was channeled into one objective: dismantling their scheme. The following morning, the Seattle rain hammered my apartment windows, mimicking the rhythm of my fury. I canceled my meetings and transformed my minimalist apartment into a war room. I began the forensic audit. 7 years of my adult life were laid out on the desk paper and screens spread across every surface. I didn't have to search. My entire professional life was built on meticulous documentation. I pulled up bank statements, each line of Jenna George Miller transfer, glowing in the monitor light. I cross-referenced the dates with the mortgage statements I had occasionally requested. The pattern was devastatingly clear. The principal balance on the Arbor View Craftsman was virtually untouched. Every one of my $1, $800 monthly deposits, my promotions, my bonuses, all had been swallowed by interest, or worse, funneled into my parents' pockets. The total over 7 years was not $92,000 as I'd first calculated, but over $120,000 in direct transfers alone. My salary had been their reliable, ever-increasing income stream. Then came the smoking gun. I clicked into an old email folder labeled Financial Oversight. 3 months prior, George had accidentally copied my work address on a short chain meant only for Eleanor. My eyes locked onto the phrase that erased any shadow of doubt. Once we sell, we can finally stop relying on Jenna's income. The word income settled the matter. It wasn't a gift, it was an expectation, an entitlement they were planning to terminate once they had extracted the maximum possible value. I printed the email, the color fading from the text, but the meaning standing out in stark black and white. I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I was an analyst, not a litigator. I needed a specialist who understood that betrayal disguised as family love was still fraud. I reached out to David Sterling, a litigation specialist with a reputation for handling complex property disputes. His retainer was steep, almost my entire emergency fund, but I viewed the cost not as an expense, but as the final necessary barrier to reclaiming my life. In his office, surrounded by leather-bound law books, I presented my paper fortress: the binders, the emails, the bank records. Sterling, a man who rarely showed emotion, was visibly impressed. "Most clients bring me a shoebox of receipts," he said, adjusting his glasses. "You've brought me a case study." We went immediately on the offensive. Within 48 hours, Sterling filed the temporary restraining order (TRO) to block the property sale. The TRO cited fraud, breach of implied contract, and unjust enrichment, a legal term that perfectly described their 7-year-long exploitation. I imagined the letter landing on George and Eleanor's expensive granite kitchen countertop, a direct legal counterstrike shocking them out of their arrogance. The shock was immediate, but their response was a predictable family's counterattack. They were masters of emotional warfare. The phone calls started instantly. First, my Aunt Carol weeping, "Jenna, honey, how could you do this to your own mother? They're heartbroken." Then texts from cousins accusing me of being a money-obsessed analyst who valued dollars over blood. My mother Eleanor orchestrated the public smear campaign, weaponizing the value of family loyalty against me in the small, tight-knit Spokane community. She leveraged every shared meal, every past favor, framing the lawsuit as an act of cruel, ungrateful abandonment. The narrative they spun was simple. Jenna, the successful big city daughter, is suing her poor aging parents out of spite. The weight of public judgment was crushing, but the anger at their continued manipulation was a powerful shield. The climax of their initial attack arrived via certified mail, a formal cease and desist letter from their lawyer, Margaret Winters. The letter, printed on thick cream-colored stationery with an embossed seal, warned me to halt all defamatory communications regarding the property. It was a cold legal threat, but to me, it was a profound relief. It proved the fear was real. They weren't fighting me with love or apology. They were fighting me with expensive lawyering. The letter was the ultimate admission of fear, confirming that their silence terrified them more than any argument ever could. I was no longer the dutiful daughter they could manipulate with tears. I was a legal adversary they had to pay to fight. And unlike them, my fight was based on facts, not fabrication. The true battle had begun. The TRO gave me a temporary ceasefire on the property sale. But the emotional war escalated, moving the conflict from a private betrayal into a broader public shame. The Miller narrative. Ungrateful daughter suing her aging parents was taking hold in Spokane, aided by Eleanor's tearful phone calls and George's mournful presence at community events. I felt the full weight of the erosion of community. David Sterling, however, ignored the noise and focused on facts. We began the witness interviews. David deposed contractors and longtime neighbors, people who had seen me, not just my money. Mrs. Henderson, a retired neighbor, recalled the summer I was 25, sweating in the triple-digit heat replacing the roof shingles myself after my promotion financed the materials. She described the same summer my sister Sarah was perpetually praised inside for her delicate nature. My former high school shop teacher, who lived 2 doors down, provided a surprisingly detailed affidavit about the sweat equity I'd put into the house, the rebuilt back deck, the extensive landscaping, and the installation of the new furnace I paid for after their old one failed unexpectedly. His testimony established the physical reality of my investment beyond the mere paper trail. The house wasn't just a financial asset to me, it was years of my physical labor. Then came the betrayal that felt less like a wound and more like a systemic failure. While sorting through a batch of subpoenaed documents, I found the evidence of my sister's true role. It was a text message thread, not between Sarah and Eleanor, but between Sarah and her fiancé discussing the lawsuit. Sarah, far from being hesitant, was calculating, "Will this cover the down payment for my wedding? I need the money for the venue." It wasn't about love or protecting our parents. It was about protecting her personal slice of the inherited exploitation. The realization hit me. Sarah was not a victim of our parents' manipulation. She was a knowing, self-interested participant, compliant, because the system benefited her. The money wasn't just my parents' entitlement. It was our family's systemic Miller system of extraction. In a move of pure spiteful malice, George executed the asset grab. Sterling notified me that George had put several pieces of furniture up for sale, including the heavy antique oak desk that my grandfather had explicitly willed to me when I was a teenager. It was a clear attempt to liquidate my personal property before the courts could intervene. I immediately filed a specific claim to block the sale of that single heirloom. It was a symbolic victory, a line drawn in the sand that said, "You will not take the last piece of my actual past." The mounting pressure culminated in the blackmail. Eleanor sent a brief, chilling text message one evening. "Drop the suit and we won't tell people about that night in high school." That night, my rebellious phase, the older boyfriend, the incident George had used to ground me for a year, and Eleanor had used to instill permanent shame. They had kept that deep vulnerability, that private shame, ready for 20 years, poised to be weaponized. The text wasn't a threat of exposure. It was the final, undeniable proof of their total moral bankruptcy. They didn't love me. They controlled me. It was the ultimate low, but instead of crushing me, it sparked a defiant resolve. I booked an emergency session with Dr. Chavez, my therapist. I sat across from her and simply handed her the blackmail text. She helped me reframe it. "Jenna," she said calmly, "this is evidence that they have nothing left. Their final tactic is to use your shame to control your personal freedom. You win when you embrace the fact that you no longer need to hide." Her words resonated with the core American value of personal freedom, the freedom to live without the fear of the past being used against you. I knew then I wouldn't hide. I forwarded the threat to Sterling. It would now serve as evidence of witness intimidation. As the family closed ranks against me, I realized the need for my own community. My professional network became my lifeline. My mentor Grace, who had quietly monitored the situation, stepped in. She provided access to her firm's high-level forensic accounting resources to further scrutinize my parents' finances far beyond what Sterling's team could afford. She told me, "You're a brilliant analyst, Jenna. Go get your data." That gesture, unprompted, unconditional support, provided a crucial counterpoint to the systemic betrayal I was fighting. I realized the community I chose was actively building scaffolding around my determination, while the family I was born into was actively trying to tear me down. I was isolated, but no longer alone. The legal system was my weapon, but the truth was my shield, and my new community was the armor that kept the shield steady. The initial TRO had bought us time, but my parents' legal counsel, Margaret Winters, proved as cold and calculating as my mother. She executed the technical flaw, a successful counterfiling based on a minute error, a transposed digit in the property parcel number. The court immediately suspended the restraining order. The legal ground shook beneath me. David Sterling called at 6:00 a.m., his voice tight. "The property sale is instantly accelerated. They're listing by Tuesday." The shock was cold, not paralyzing. Panic was an inefficiency I couldn't afford. I was in his office within 40 minutes, adrenaline replacing fear. We launched the all-night push. My analyst training took over. I was no longer a betrayed daughter. I was a data weapon focused on triage. We reviewed every page of the corrected TRO filing, cross-referencing legal statutes with my bank statements. My professional mettle was tested against theirs. I lived on black coffee and adrenaline, the pressure forcing me into my most efficient state. I requested an expedited hearing based on the imminent threat of liquidation, hoping to beat their listing date. As we worked, Sterling put me through a brutal mock cross-examination. He played my father George, dismissive and charming, then my mother Eleanor, tearful and manipulative. "Tell me about the plumbing repair, Jenna. Did you have a written contract?" "No, wasn't that just a daughter helping her father?" He forced me to see the upcoming court appearance not as a family confrontation, but a business transaction. "Your emotional truth is irrelevant here. Facts only. The number, the date, the purpose." I learned to filter out the grief and speak only the data. Sterling also uncovered evidence of a deeper conspiracy. George, through his longtime fishing buddy, had solicited an affidavit from Thomas, an estranged cousin of mine. Thomas was claiming I had verbally agreed the payments were gifts to the family during a casual conversation years ago. It was a flimsy, perjured lie, but it showed the lengths they would go to weaponizing every weak link in the family chain. I realized my entire family network was being systematically mobilized against me. Eleanor and George made their final strategic move, intending to use public pressure where the law might fail. They invited the external jury, not just our immediate family, but their entire social circle, neighbors, church members, and bridge club friends, to the expedited hearing. Their intent was clear: to leverage the cultural power of shame and paint me as the villain to the court of public opinion. They wanted the gallery to be their defense. The morning of the hearing, I stood in the elevator mirror, the dark circles under my eyes a testament to 48 hours of non-stop work. I wasn't scared. I was focused. The court was marble and judgment a far cry from the cozy craftsman porch. As I entered the lobby, I saw Eleanor huddled with Margaret Winters. Eleanor spotted me. Her expression was meticulously practiced, calculated, sorrowful pity. I didn't flinch. I straightened my blazer, adjusting the charcoal fabric. I realized my capacity for cold transactional justice was now fully engaged. Sterling put his hand on my arm. "Ready?" he asked. "No." I admitted, my eyes locked on my mother. "But I'm going anyway." The knowledge that I had anticipated their lies and documented every move gave me a quiet, steely resolve. My strategic silence was about to become my loudest weapon. The courtroom was vast, filled with polished oak and the heavy silence of imminent judgment. The gallery, packed with the external jury, church, friends, neighbors, and extended family, was a visible testament to my parents' narrative. Every familiar face was turned toward me, their expressions a blend of pity and condemnation. I straightened my spine. The judge, Judge Harding, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper reputation for cutting through financial fraud, entered. I used my analyst training, counting the facts, feeling the cool leather of the chair, anything to maintain my cold professional composure. This was the moment I stopped being Jenna Miller, their daughter, and became the plaintiff. The proceedings began with George, my father. He took the stand, his tall frame slightly stooped, radiating a folksy charm and feigned confusion. He presented himself as the kindly, aging father, baffled by his daughter's sudden vengeance. He testified that the transfers were simply generous, unsolicited gifts between family members. He spoke of his love and the burden of the house. He was magnetic, painting a sympathetic portrait that almost made me doubt myself. David Sterling stood. He ignored George's charm and went straight for the jugular, introducing Exhibit F, a simple text message. The image was projected onto a screen for the entire court to see. It was from George to me, dated last June. "Thanks for covering the property taxes again. We'll square up when the market improves," George stammered, claiming it was merely a figure of speech. Judge Harding's pen hovered over her notepad. The word "square up" had no folksy interpretation. It was a clear admission of debt. The gift narrative began to crack. Eleanor was next, ready with her performance. As she took the stand, she instantly resorted to her practiced tears and quivering voice, speaking of the deep sorrow I was causing. She denied any knowledge of the sale or any intention to exclude me. She looked toward the gallery, eliciting sympathetic murmurs. Sterling nodded politely, then asked permission to play a recording. The bailiff set up the equipment. The courtroom fell silent. Eleanor's voice, startlingly clear and flat, filled the room. "Once we sell, you and your father can finally take that Alaska cruise. Jenna's transfers were nothing but gifts." The audio recorded from my original confrontation was devastating. The tears stopped. The color drained from my mother's face, leaving her a sickly gray. The gallery shifted, their collective judgment momentarily turning inward. The exposed calculation shattered her credibility. Margaret Winters, our opposition, then attempted her most venomous move. She stood and moved to introduce the high school incident, arguing it demonstrated my history of rebellious behavior and lack of filial trust. She was trying to shift the focus from fraud to character assassination. Before she could elaborate, Sterling was on his feet, objecting and introducing Eleanor's blackmail text as evidence of witness intimidation. He detailed her cynical attempt to leverage my past shame to influence litigation. Judge Harding, visibly angered by the ethical breach, slammed her gavel. "The court will not tolerate attempts to suborn testimony or engage in intimidation tactics." Point struck from the record. Eleanor recoiled, and the last shred of the defense's moral high ground disintegrated. The time for theatrics was over. Sterling began the systematic presentation. He signaled the bailiff, who wheeled in a cart containing the 7 binders, each one labeled by year 2018 through 2024. The visual impact was undeniable, 7 years of my life meticulously catalogued. For the next 75 minutes, Sterling methodically mapped out the evidence. He narrated the timeline starting when I was 23 and fresh out of college, detailing the $700 payments that grew with every promotion I earned, hitting $800 monthly when I reached my senior analyst position. He matched specific deposits to specific property tax bills. He showed the emails where George requested just enough to cover the mortgage this month, 2 days after my promotion was announced. He showed the photos of me on the roof, installing the new windows I paid for, while the sister they protected was relaxing nearby. My professional meticulousness became my superpower. The gallery was silent, no longer a jury of condemnation, but a collection of stunned witnesses. Sterling concluded, arguing that the Millers' narrative was a fabrication, and that their own texts and recording proved intentional deception. He ended with the forensic conclusion: Your Honor, based on the documented financial contribution and the defendant's clear acknowledgement of debt, we assert the plaintiff has established an equitable interest. Then came Sarah. She was called as the defense's final desperate emotional witness. She looked fragile just as she always had, but underneath the helplessness, I saw the self-interest I had identified. Sterling's cross-examination was brief and focused. He asked her gently to look at the photos of me on the roof. Ms. Miller, did you know your parents were planning to sell the Arbor View house and leave your sister out of the proceeds even as she paid the mortgage? Sarah glanced at Eleanor and George, then down at her hands. The tension was suffocating. She whispered a sound barely audible. Yes. Sterling leaned in. Even though she had paid the mortgage for 7 years, Sarah, tears beginning to stream, offered the only defense she had. She could afford it. I couldn't. It was a confession rooted in selfishness, not remorse. Her final sentence was the final nail in the coffin, confirming the systemic, self-interested betrayal that had characterized my entire childhood. The forensic accounting expert took the stand next. Calculating my total contribution, including improvements and interest, I could prove at $150,000. Based on current market value, he concluded, that represents approximately a 35% equity stake in the property. I sat motionless as the expert finished. The emotional journey was over. Only the law remained. The courtroom held its breath after Sarah's whispered confession. The emotional climax was spent, replaced by a devastating quiet. I hadn't expected Sarah to break. I had only expected her to lie, but her lie of omission, her justification, she could afford it, I couldn't, was more damning than any lie of commission. It was an indictment of the Miller system of extraction, confirming the entire family was complicit and calculating. Sarah's tears were not for me, but for her own financial peril, sealing the painful, complete emotional clarity I had sought. The forensic conclusion followed, delivered by a quiet, meticulous CPA who specialized in evaluating small business fraud. He took the stand and confirmed the numbers Sterling had presented. Ms. Miller's documented cash contributions, totaling $120,000, combined with the conservative estimate of her labor and material costs for essential property improvements, the roof, the furnace, the plumbing, equates to a total financial stake of approximately $150,000. He stated, his voice clinical. Based on the Arbor View's current market valuation, that $150,000 represents a clear, verifiable 35% equitable stake in the property. The testimony was irrefutable data overriding decades of emotional manipulation. Judge Harding didn't waste time with a recess. She looked over the bench, her gaze sweeping the gallery and settling finally on George and Eleanor. The tension in the courtroom was a physical weight. She delivered the judge's ruling with cold precision, speaking not to me or my parents, but to the legal record. The court finds that the plaintiff, Jennifer Miller, has established an overwhelming evidentiary basis that the funds transferred were not gifts, but contributions toward the property's upkeep and mortgage, explicitly acknowledged by the defendants as repayable debt. She then used the phrase that validated my 7 years of silent sacrifice. The defendants engaged in fiduciary exploitation under the guise of familial expectation. Her voice hardened as she reached the conclusion. The court grants the plaintiff a 35% equitable interest in the property. The house is ordered to be sold with all proceeds divided accordingly under court supervision. The gavel fell once sharp and definitive. It wasn't elation I felt, but a profound sense of transactional justice. The war was over and the ledger was balanced. George, shocked out of his calculated composure, instantly launched George's last plea as court was formally adjourned. He scrambled toward the defense table, his composure fracturing. "Jenna, wait. We need to talk. We only did this because we thought you were going to move to London for that job last year. We were afraid you'd leave us and we'd be ruined. We panicked." He was desperate, attempting one last pathetic manipulation to frame the betrayal as an act of fear, not malice. But his words only solidified the truth. The betrayal was not an anomaly. It was a preemptive strike rooted in their own insecurity and fear of losing their financial lifeline. They didn't betray me because they were greedy. They betrayed me because they were terrified of losing control over me. I gathered my binders, stacking the 7 years of documentation with steady, unhurried movements. I looked past him, my silence now a physical, impenetrable barrier. I walked past Eleanor, who sat frozen, her face now a mask of pure, self-pitying horror. I left the courtroom without acknowledging either of them. My silence was the final, devastating answer. Outside the courtroom, David Sterling shook my hand, genuine admiration in his eyes. "You did it, Jenna. You held the line." The immediate emotional response was exhaustion, but the secondary feeling was freedom. The reality of the verdict materialized in numbers: house value approximately $740,000. My portion $259,000 after all legal fees and costs were netted out. A clean, undeniable fact. But the Millers had one final pathetic move. As we discussed the next steps, Sterling received a frantic call. "Jenna," he said, his expression grim, "George just filed a change of address with the county assessor's office. He's trying to redirect the final sale documents to a private P.O. box in Boise. The hidden account, the final cynical act." Even after the ruling, their attempt to steal continued, a desperate, predictable grab for the court-controlled money. The final act of the betrayal was a relief. It meant I felt no guilt, no temptation to reconcile. I simply told Sterling, "File for an urgent order to freeze that P.O. box and route all sale funds through court escrow. They're still proving my case." I had anticipated their greed. I had predicted their lack of remorse. The long road of litigation had not been about revenge. It had been about the necessary transactional act of claiming my own unfettered life. The court ruled on the facts, and the facts were mine. I had won the battle for my future. The verdict was the end of one life and the beginning of another. There was no joy, just the immense relief of knowing the truth was settled by law. But my parents, ever predictable, executed the final countermaneuver. David Sterling filed the urgent order to freeze the P.O. box in Boise and reroute all sale funds through court escrow. They were trying to steal their own share, desperate to evade court oversight. I felt no rage, only a weary confirmation that their greed was a core, unchangeable part of their identity. The Arborview Craftsman sold 6 weeks later. The final transfer hit my account on a cold Friday afternoon. The sale and the check, $259,000. Not a prize, not a windfall, but a reclamation. It was my own stolen effort returned. I didn't spend a dime on frivolous things. I immediately transferred a large portion into a segregated savings account, and the rest I earmarked for the down payment on a new life. I was still seeing Dr. Chavez, and my sessions transitioned from crisis management to genuine grief work. We focused on the therapeutic breakthrough, the profound loss of the idea of the family I thought I had. "The American value they exploited, Jenna," Dr. Chavez explained, "was your resilience and your self-reliance. They saw your strength and treated it as an endless resource." I worked through the guilt, recognizing that my strength was my own and it was no longer their tool. I spent weeks searching not for a house, but for a home, a space that mirrored my emotional clarity. I found it in the new home, a modern top-floor condo in Seattle's Capitol Hill, all glass, steel, and clean light. The design was minimalist, a radical departure from the cluttered, suffocating sentimentality of the craftsman. There was no heirloom furniture, no obligation to keep a vase because Grandma loved it. Every piece was chosen by me, for me. The move was the final rite of passage. I took a few hours off work for the lock ritual. I had purchased new high-grade steel locks, heavy and cold in my hand. I retrieved the old tarnished brass deadbolt from the Arbor View house which I'd taken before the buyer's locksmith arrived. I placed the relic in a small plain wooden box, closed the lid, and tucked it away on a high shelf. It was the physical representation of the life they had shut me out of. I then took my tools and installed the new locks myself, feeling the satisfying click of the deadbolts engaging. These locks were installed by choice, not necessity. They were a boundary, physical and psychological. Then came the inevitable attempt at reconciliation, the final cut. Sarah sent a lengthy email subject line, "Can't we just heal?" The body was a familiar blend of half apology, vague references to misunderstandings, and subtle blame shifting. "Mom is sick now and you know stress affects her condition." It was the same predictable script of emotional manipulation. I read the email once, recognizing the pattern instantly. There was no flicker of anger or temptation. I simply deleted the email and blocked the address. The emotional break was complete. I felt a profound sense of peace. That evening I sat in my new living room, the city lights below, sharp and beautiful. I pulled out my journal and wrote my final entry regarding the Millers. My thoughts flowed easily, the words summarizing my emotional journey. "I don't need approval. My worth isn't measured by what I can provide to others." I realized the litigation had not been a vengeful act, but an aggressive act of self-preservation. I had claimed my inheritance, the right to define my own life and finance my own future. My money was mine, working for me, not flowing out to support their deceit. I finally understood that my strength, my resilience, was meant to build my own foundation, not shore up theirs. I had lost a family, but I had gained myself. 3 months after the final transfer, my new life was silent, clean, and entirely mine. The last weekend in November, I hosted a housewarming party, an act of intentionality that marked the final separation. This gathering was for the chosen community. David Sterling, who had fought with clinical detachment, Grace, who had lent me her resources without asking for anything in return, and Dr. Chavez, who had helped me navigate the psychological landmines. As the laughter filled the condo, I realized this was my real family, the people who saw my worth, not my bank account. They had earned their place in my space, unlike the Millers, who felt entitled to it. The money, reclaimed from the betrayal, was already working. A significant portion was devoted to setting up the Miller Resilience Fund. I was determined to transform my pain into purpose. The fund was a legal aid nonprofit specifically designed for young adults who were victims of family financial abuse, particularly those whose parents used the emotional power of family loyalty to execute long-term fraud. I was taking the American value of resilience and paying it forward. I scheduled a meeting with Sterling to review the fund's first case. "The first recipient meets with you next week," Sterling confirmed. "A young man whose parents drained his college fund." I agreed to mentor him, but anonymously. I planned to share my story not for publicity, but as a blueprint for self-advocacy. The fight had been costly, but it had earned me the unique authority to guide others out of the same psychological trap. That night, alone in my new quiet condo, I pulled out my journal for the final journal entry, the catharsis. I wrote in detail about the sense of freedom, the emotional lightness that had replaced the constant crushing weight of their expectations. The words flowed easily, settling the score. Not with them, but with myself. I realized my worth isn't measured by what I can provide to others. I don't need approval. I don't need the door to open. My fatal flaw, the hunger for their validation, is tamed. I have claimed my ultimate inheritance, my own unfettered life. The next morning, I met with my financial advisor and Sterling to update my will. I confirmed I was leaving nothing to the Millers. We established confidential address protection for my peace of mind and finalized the paperwork for the Miller Resilience Fund. The legal structure was complete. Later that afternoon, a quiet moment brought the final sense of closure. I walked through the condo, admiring the high ceilings and the unburdened space. I opened the wooden box I had tucked away and looked at the old tarnished brass deadbolt, the last relic of the Arborview house. I picked it up, feeling its cold, heavy weight one last time before replacing it on the shelf. I walked toward the window, watching the Seattle sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, the kind of beauty I had never allowed myself to simply enjoy before. I was alone, but profoundly at peace. I whispered to the empty sunlit room, speaking the final complete truth that the 7-year ordeal had delivered. Home isn't where you're born, it's where you're valued. I closed the box firmly, placing it back on the shelf, leaving it to gather dust. The emotional debt was canceled, the ledger balanced, the locks changed, the future funded. My journey had been agonizing, but it had successfully taken me from a state of complete vulnerability to absolute empowerment. I murmured one final thought, a testament to the long game: revenge burns fast, justice builds slowly and lasts longer. And with the last journal entry closed, Jennifer Miller finally claimed the independence her parents tried so hard to deny her. If this story of betrayal and hard-won justice resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to Revenge Hour for more stories where the wronged fight back. We read every single comment of your thoughts below. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.